welcome to Policy and Politics. With me, Tarun Nangia. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has set an ambitious target of service exports for India for about $1,000 billion. Currently, we are about at $230 billion, if I'm not wrong. And he says India has been a phenomenal success story as far as service exports are concerned. He also spoke about India's potential not only in things like software, but also tourism, he said, which was a big untapped sector. We're going to explore this idea that our Commerce Minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal, has given us and discuss India's potential and how India in the next decade or so will achieve this target of going from $230 billion to $1,000 billion with growth rates of 7 and 8% and significant growth rates specifically in services, how this is going to be possible. I have an eminent panel with me. I have with me Manik Davar, who joins me for the first time on Policy and Politics. Welcome, Mr. Davar.
Thank you, Tarun. A pleasure to be with you.
To those who don't know, Mr. Davar is the chairman of the Services Export Sector Council, which is a unit under the Ministry of Commerce. I have with me Dr. Vijay Kalantri. You would have seen him earlier on Policy and Politics also. He is the chairman of the World Trade Center and a well-known industrialist. Dr. Kalantri, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
I would like to welcome Mr. Mohit Saraf on Policy and Politics for the first time. Mr. Saraf, welcome. Mr. Saraf, as you know, is a managing partner of Saraf and Partners, a well-known law firm. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tarun. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So let us begin with the opening comment. I'll go to Dr. Vijay Kalantri to lay the ground from the World Trade Center standpoint, $1,000 billion. What do you feel of this target? You have seen India's success story since liberalization. Where do we stand and where are we headed?
First of all, thank you. It's a very good subject. And after COVID, it has become more important and relevant than it was earlier. So the growth can be phenomenal. But when we fix a target of growth, whether it is 1,000 billion or 1,000 million or more, whatever may be, like in exports, we have been fixing up targets on year on year and sometimes for 5 years. But to meet the targets, you should have a roadmap. Besides roadmap, you have to have the proper infrastructure. Second is, you have to give them infrastructure support. You have to see that what the sector need is. I remember a small joke about Mr. Pramod Mahajan. When IT sector was growing, and when the previous regime of NDA and IT sector was growing, and in the fashion world, we were having Miss Universe, Miss World from India. So he said, these both sectors are growing because there is no ministry for this sector. There were no ministries for IT, there were no ministry for fashion world. So, and it is growing because nobody is interfering in it. But we need ministry, we need a system in place, we need administration in place. So our IT sector is very competent. They made us brand India. How did we come to, in the world, we again regained our value and brand name for India was through IT. That's the information technology. And today, the world is growing. Everybody is thinking IT means India. And everybody is looking at us very seriously. But we should not lose out on it. It's a good ambitious target. We should have a roadmap. And wherever, like Manik is a chairman of Services Export Council, he knows the issues and problems faced. So financial support. You have to have a guidelines also of the banks and all, which should be conducive to the growth of the sector. You can't have banks and RBI can't have their guidelines and their sector. They say we go by these norms. No. You have to sometimes relax your norms to suit the industry and trade which can develop. and potential to develop and intention to develop and do not have any other intention. So in such cases, we have to be more liberal, more proactive, and tune with in time with tune. You have to tune it properly so that nobody faces any problem for growth or going forward.
Okay, point very well taken. I'll go to Mr. Manik Dawar. He's heading the software, as I said, the Services Export Promotion Council. Mr. Dawar, how do you see this panning out? The minister's vision, the potential of Indian entrepreneurs, and the support that they will receive from the government.
I agree with my friend Vijay Kalantri when he says that there has to be some amount of government support and intervention for growth. But the minister has often said that services have grown because of least government interference and government impediments. While he's right there still are anomalies which require to be addressed. And as Vijay Bhai said, infrastructure needs to be developed. Now, the most important part here, there are two parts which are very important. One is that services sector is not IT/ITES only. Though IT/ITES contribute between 45 to 50% of our services exports, the other key sectors are travel, tourism, education, healthcare, logistics, management consultancy, legal, chartered accountancy, so on and so forth. So there are 12 champion sectors, and then there are other services. So first, the important discussion is not around only IT/ITES, because that is the first thing that comes to people's mind and they don't go beyond it. The second thing which I have really sort of worked on during my tenure was the perception of, that services exports in the sense has. Let us understand a couple of issues as far as this is concerned. First, the services exports add to the credibility and the reputation of India. India can be a cradle for services. It can never be a cradle for manufacturing, because that role has already been taken by other nations who are inimical to us. Second, it is a great source of employment. The services sector has grown from 22% to 32%, providing employment to people. The services sector is 53% of your economy. As far as services exports go, this year when merchandise exports are going to touch $400 billion, you are going to have a deficit of $200 billion because you're going to import $600 billion worth of merchandise and manufacturing versus the $400 billion. So there is a $200 billion net this thing. According to our calculation, the services exports will contribute $110 billion surplus, net surplus. That means your imports will be $110 billion less than your exports. So these are very crucial elements. If you want to reduce your imbalance, you have got to concentrate heavily on services. Now, what I have been saying is this, that all the time when you speak and when you talk of exports, the Prime Minister took a meeting wherein he said $400 billion exports. But what I wanted to remind is that it's not $400 billion of exports which you will reach. You will actually reach a target of somewhere around 640 and $650 billion, because 240 to $250 billion will come from the services industry. And this is happening, and the growth has been phenomenal. And this has been happening in spite of the fact that in 2021, we lost $21 billion in tourism alone. And we ended with a negative of only about $6 billion. So the other industries in a pandemic year contributed an additional $15 billion. So still the tourism industry and other industries like travel, education, your healthcare has not come to its to the levels, pre-pandemic levels. And yet we are looking at phenomenal growth. This is the first time. So I have also suggested that just as you are giving incentives to industry, like your your productivity linked incentive, PLI, and the greenfield tax, this thing. There is no reason why the same cannot be given to services, especially those services which are asset heavy, like hospitals and hotels and education and universities. So I think there has to be, now let us also put something in perspective, that the largest service, the trade which happens, service exporter in the world is the US, with about $700 billion worth of service exports. So no country in the world has touched the $1 trillion of services exports. So certainly this is an ambitious target. And whether you realize this target or don't realize this target, as I've said, is not the important factor. As Vijay said, there has to be a roadmap, and there has to be an overall plan to keep on increasing service sector by at least 20% to 25% year on year. This year, we will grow at 15%, regardless of the fact that we don't have tourism.
Okay. Point very well taken. A good set of points shared on the role of services in terms of India's total export basket. I'll go to Mr. Moritz Saraf, Managing Partner of Saraf and Partners. Mr. Saraf, the Minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal, highlighted the role of law firms in the whole service exports journey in two ways. One, the fact that law firms themselves contribute in this process of service exports. Secondly, the role of law itself as a service export, in a sense, from India. How would you delve into this issue?
If you look at the foreign direct investment numbers, almost over 50% of it comes in service sector. That is a very important part. And I think, as what Mr. Kalantri said, that what you need to do is have a right roadmap. And roadmap is right now, whenever you talk about export of services, you get confused with IT and IT related. And I think what is important is to identify these areas like management services, KPO, legal services, management services, and then have a roadmap for each section. I think that is an important part. Otherwise, getting to $1 trillion, as what Manik said, that is impossible because no country has reached it. But if you actually start dividing it, like you have already 230 in IT and IT related, and you start dividing it at a rate of 20% CAGR for each sector, and you start doing that, then you can get it. Even if you look at really, if one of the important thing is medical tourism, the very important part is education. Now, I think right now that is I think low-lying fruit. But a lot of areas, if you see, FDI is not permitted in education institution, for-profit education institution. Now, if FDI is permitted, amount of student tourists which will come and the export we can do is actually unbelievable. And also will also not lead to foreign exchange expenditure for sending students outside. So these are very good things. And also this helps you to attract high quality medical tourism, because really what you do is you have best medical universities here, and then they have a research, and then you start attracting the high quality to medical tourists. So these are very, very important. I think the other important issue will be to make India as a hub for arbitration. I think this is again a very important, this actually can become much easier. But again, remember that a lot of time arbitration awards are challenged. The courts take a lot of time before it can be implemented. If that be so, whatever the government try to build up an arbitration hub, it will be very limited. Even if you look at attracting investment, legal work is pretty much heavy duty. And actually what it does is it actually replaces foreign lawyers to Indian lawyers, which is in a way is like you're exporting your services. And this is again a very large thing. Even on the legal KPO side, there are a lot of regulatory issues under the Bar Council rules and under the advocate law, that whether you are providing legal services or not, whether you need to be, everybody has to be an advocate. Company, typical KPO system is that you have to have a company or an LLP. And these companies often get notices from Bar Council that you are practicing law. So a lot of these regulatory, I think what Mr. Kalantri said, that basically you have to have a roadmap, you have to identify 7-8 pocket areas, then start removing problem areas. Like I said, Bar Council issues. and you start removing it, and then you have smaller target for them. And clearly, I would say whether IT and IT related services may not require incentive, but these other areas will clearly require incentive, like a PLI scheme for them to be competitive in the initial year. So I think these targets are achievable. And as what Mr. Kalantri said, that instead of production, manufacturing, services is something we can easily achieve. But for that, we need to really have a proper approach to get there.
I just want to say something here. I didn't use the word impossible for achieving this target. It's going to be difficult, but nowhere have I said it is going to be impossible. Just wanted to correct that impression.
I'll go to Dr. Vijay Kalantri. So if you see that in the past 30 years or so, software accounted for a lion's share of our exports. Do you think the journey will be very different from here on, or it will be similar, that software will continue to dominate tourism, knowledge process outsourcing, legal services will piggyback on the elephant that is software exports?
No. I think nobody's going to piggyback on each other. But software will grow and without any hindrance. This is my view, because the new generation or young generation, whatever we call, they are very tech savvy. And that is one of the reasons I think the Commerce Minister, Mr. Goyal, has thought that looking at the skills which are in our country, and we see how we developed in IT, we became a brand name because of IITs. See, because of IITs. If we didn't have IITs, today we would not have seen this day of talking about digital economy in India growing, or talking about skills in this sector. But that was the starting point. Now, of course, like my grandchildren are more tech savvy than myself, and people like to prefer that. But as you rightly said, this is, and Manik rightly said, that it is not impossible. It is achievable. But at the same time, you have to plan it out very systematically. You have to see the global scenario and you focus where are the growth sectors, which areas we can grow. Like Mr. Saraf talked about arbitration, talked about healthcare, Manik talked about tourism services. So you should identify those some sectors and lay a thrust on them. And also those sectors in our country we should develop. Not only the exports, but if you have the same areas development in your country, people look at it. In India, this is happening, why not we do in our country? Similarly, we can do that. So it's a very a long process. It has to be a very thoughtful process, and we need to plan it out in a proper way so that we move forward. Today, talking growth and figures, everybody talks. Sometimes some people say, next 5 years we'll go this way, that 5 years. And after 1 year, he's not a minister also. So what roadmap and ideas he has are not implemented. And the bureaucracy changes from time to time. So if Manik is given an assignment or a task, and he should be there for 5 years. If he's an officer, concerned, expert or advisor, whoever it is. If he is not there for 5 years, he can't meet the target and he can't carry it forward. Because I remember that Devang Mehta, who was NESCOM, and how he created brand name and euphoria world over. The Thai organization came in, NESCOM came in, and all things happened. And everybody was talking, we have to attend NESCOM function because that is where the IT world lies, the Thai meetings. Those euphoria has gone away.
You made a set of very good points, Dr. Kalantri. I'll go to Mr. Manik Dawar at this point. Mr. Dawar, 2 points. Is the Service Export Promotion Council emerging at the NASCOM for India A? Second, you would have done some study which sectors, one by one, do you see will emerge as the leading lights of our service exports for our economy in the next 5-6 years or so?
We held, which you referred to, we held a global services conclave a couple of days ago. And the theme of the global conclave was beyond IT, ITES. So identifying the sectors that will grow. Certainly, if you have to go to $1 trillion export target, IT, ITES will have to play a role. But today, where they are about 45 to 50% of the total exports, certainly the need is this, that you have to develop other sectors to achieve that target. Now, let us look at it from a totally holistic view on this. Let's take one sector, which is tourism. The minister said once that today we are getting 10 million tourists. Why can't we get 50 million tourists? We can certainly, now from 10 million tourists, we can certainly go at least 3 times that in the next 10 years. There is no bar to that. But you have to be able to have the infrastructure of ports of entry, which in this case are largely airports. You have to have the infrastructure of hospitality, which is hotels. You have the infrastructure of travel and tourism, which is roads, which is the local domestic, whether it is by air or whether it is by rail, interlinking. And can you imagine that today, I think tourism, I will not vouch for the figures, but the tourism and everything allied to it is a huge employment. It's a huge employment base. It's a huge base for entrepreneurship. There are so many people in the transport business who are owning taxis and private taxis and vehicles, who have lost their livelihood because of the pandemic, right? So can you imagine the focus that if you put on tourism, the amount of benefit that it will come to this country? So certainly you have to, but you can't do it without, and this is where the government comes in. Incentives to build hotels, incentives to expand airports, incentives to come in with aviation, right? So today, for example, in aviation, there are so many hurdles. There's so many, the cost of ATF, whatever it is, it's a very high operational thing. And we know that even airlines which are going to 70 and 80% capacity are losing money. So to once again encapsulate what we have been saying is that recognition of services sector and services export sector at par with industry, to give it some sort of a status and to provide it with incentives. Now, very important part of this is this, that these incentives are to make your sector competitive. They are not just handouts. People are taking that as handouts, but they are not handouts. They are to make the sector competitive with, in the case of tourism, with the whole of Southeast Asia, with Thailand and Malaysia and all. And let us not forget that you may give the best quality of services in terms of, say, medical, right? You may have the best doctor, the best hospitals, but finally it will be the cost that will be determinant. If somebody gets the same amount he pays in UK for a surgery, the UK person is certainly not going to come down to India for that same surgery. So there is the cost benefit will have to be there for everything. And for that cost benefit, you will have to create infrastructure and you will have to support that infrastructure.
Okay, point very well taken. I'll go to Mr. Mohit Saraf for his intervention on this issue.
I think what Mr. Davar said is the most appropriate. I think a lot of these assets, whether it's a hospitality, whether it's medical healthcare facilities, these are all very cost heavy or asset heavy in facilities. And they would require a fair amount of government support initially. And I think what he rightly said, that this makes it more competitive. It's not a handout. I think really at the end of the day, today, everybody in India wants to go to Thailand because it's cheaper than to go to Goa. The hotels are cheaper, everything is cheaper. So I think that is the important part. That if you need to get your tourism to 3 times, then you have to have these micro numbers, how to attract, whether you have the pricing power, whether you have the infrastructure, whether you are giving. And the same thing you need to follow every area. Today, right now, IT related adds up to $200 million. And therefore, you have to make it small for everything and say this is a $10 million, $10 billion or $20 billion target for next year, and then work on it. And therefore, you have to make sure that you monitor. I think in my view, we build up as what Mr. Kalantri said, that you have a target for 10 years and then you go off to sleep. And then you realize that we've never missed it. So a really important thing is to have smaller targets, annual target, follow sector by sector, follow by 20, like you have to go to 10 to 20 CAGR annually, follow that and look at it, what is ailing really at the end of the day, whether it's a price issue, whether it's an infrastructure issue. Today, post-COVID, I think we have such a good amount of data connectivity. We have a natural advantage, maybe not for healthcare, not for education, but a lot of advantage we have for management that people can sit at home and work through data connectivity. So we have an advantage, but that doesn't mean that we need to just sit on it. Because if we have to get to $100 trillion, $1 trillion export services export target, I think as Mr. Davar said, this is achievable target, but achievable provided we break it in small doses and sector by sector, and then build annually and build policies where the RBI and SEBI and FDI has to all work together. If the regulators are not working, everybody has a different policy for profit university versus not profit university. If you have that, then these targets will continue to be only a talking target and we'll never achieve that.
I need to come in here, Tarun, with your permission. One very important fact which people really don't know about. During the pandemic and even before that, the Commerce Minister every month holds a meeting of all export promotion councils with all senior commerce bureaucrats, DG, FT, everybody present. That meeting goes on for more than 4 hours. Every EPC presents its issues that they have, where they are going, what they are doing. And everything is monitored to the extent. Now, let me also say that $400 billion target, which they have gone from $290 billion to $400 billion, and we still are suffering from the pandemic. It's a huge increase. What has happened is this, that every sector, every EPC is monitored by the Commerce Minister and the Commerce Ministry literally on a day-to-day basis. They have all the figures, they have all this, and they are hand-holding right through. If they do the same for services, and there is no reason that they should not, and they will, I have no doubt, right, that we will also grow exponentially. The target is certainly there, but what is important is this growth which has to come in. You may or may not reach the target. That is, according to me, that is not really material. But the intention which is there, the intensity which is there, which is brought to the table, especially by the Commerce Minister, you have absolutely no idea. And after 4 hours of discussion, 28 EPCs in the manufacturing and the merchandise sector putting forth their points. After 4 hours of discussion, the minister is completely aware of each and every problem, and he talks about it. And sometimes there's a phone call made immediately across this thing to the shipping minister, to ports, to whatever, to see that these problems are solved. So I think people need to know the seriousness with which this government works, and especially the Commerce Ministry, of which I have personal experience.
Thank you so much for sharing that anecdote with us, with how the work goes on in the Commerce Ministry and how sectors are encouraged. It was a nice discussion today. We got a perspective from the industry, from the legal standpoint, law firm standpoint, from Mr. Davar on the ministry standpoint. I would like to thank Mr. Manik Davar, Chairman of the Services Export Promotion Council. I think before I end, Mr. Dr. Vijay Kalantri wants to come in for a minute and then we will end.
Before I started with one point was on finance, RBI and banks. Davar made a very important point that the hospitality sector, tourism, the transport, the hotels, how they suffered during COVID. I tell you one small thing. Other day, the taxi which I hired from the group, they had 100 taxis before COVID. And that day, his owner was saying, sir, I am now only with 50. Banks forced me to sell 50. So, this is small where if tourism and hospitality sector, it has to go proper infrastructure. You have to have earmarked funds, earmarked support that yes, these sectors, like Malik said very rightly, Commerce Minister monitors everything. But they have to take on board the connected ministries like finance, RBI, meeting of the banks. He has to have a joint meeting with the finance minister on finance. Because his policy finally goes to the finance minister to allocate the funds, to allocate the support, or whatever may be. Or either you take on board, you first discuss with Prime Minister, and Prime Minister says this should be done, and this is okay. Like, MSME, earlier they were 12 to 13% finances given by RBI. Now it has come down to 8.3%. So, nobody sees that. Then you talk about growth.
Tarun, can I add one point?
I just wanted to make a small point on that.
Yeah.
Tarun, can I add one point here?
30 seconds because you're out of time.
Yeah, I think the most important part, as what Mr. Davar said, is once we have a target, we should have an accountability to the target. We should not have the target should be looked at whether we made enough movement, because the intention is not relevant. In my view, what is relevant is if you have a target, then it has to be an achievable target. And if people make a target and you can't achieve, then I think there should be people on line. And that is an important thing, because target with intention never gets anywhere. I think, and no company gives quarterly target and with an intention. So if you have a target, you have to get there. And I think before we get a target, we have to have an achievable target, like what we're talking about, $5 trillion, $10 trillion. And the same thing, we have to do it. Because once the government and the ministry start looking at target which is achievable, then they will know what needs to be done. And then we will get there. Because otherwise, we will not get there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saraf, for sharing that anecdote with us. I know we were discussing targets and timelines when we were doing the Lakshmi Mittal SR deal. You were saying that this resolution should happen at this time, but that discussion is for another day. Thank you so much, Dr. Kalantri. Thank you so much, Mr. Saraf. Thank you so much, Mr. Davar, for joining us. It was indeed a pleasure to have you all. And I hope everyone, in a sense, who watches would enjoy this discussion. Thank you so much.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.